The heart of your computer is the CPU, and you've got some CPU choices to make. Nowadays, if you buy a computer, probably the minimum power you'd buy, just possibly, might be a Pentium MMX. That's about the oldest thing you could possibly imagine. The minimum that most of us have, though, is some machine that's a member of the so-called P6 family or Pentium II systems. I want to show you a few of those, talk a little bit about how they're packaged, how they're cooled, and how much you can swap them around. Now, the baby brother of the Pentium II family is a chip called the Celeron. The Celeron is simpler than the other chips because, as you're going to see, it has no memory associated with it. Because it has no cache memory associated with it, Intel's able to sell it cheaper, and really what they're trying to do is knock off their competition. The AMD and Cyrix guys are actually selling maybe more than 3 or 4% of the CPUs, so Intel fears them. So they've got a cheap version, which is the Celeron. Celeron goes up to about 400 megahertz, but I'm sure that in time it will get even faster. Now, one thing that you'll run into with CPUs, though, is that CPUs are more and more and more compact. Back when PCs first came out, you would see a PC with on the order of 27,000 transistors crushed into a small space, a space about the size of your thumbnail. Nowadays, though, in the Pentium world, we are literally talking about millions of transistors crushed into that same small space. And you know what that means? That means heat. When things run fast, higher megahertz, you know that phrase, it's like horsepower, bigger numbers are better. Higher megahertz generates more heat. So if you take the exact same chip and run it at, say, 30 megahertz or 60 megahertz, and nobody runs them at those speeds anymore, but using that as an example, take that same chip, run it at 60 megahertz, it runs hotter than when the same chip runs at 30 megahertz. So the fact that chips are running faster than they used to makes them hotter, and the fact that they're more compact means they also run hotter. That means we've had to get a little clever about the way that we keep these things cooled, and typically what we see are fans. This particular Celeron was packaged with a fan. It's a little small fan unit, and the unit is attached to the CPU like so. But how do we get it to stay? Well, that depends. In most cases, there's some sort of an adhesive or epoxy. And in this particular case, it's this little piece of paper. If I pull this off, I can permanently affix the CPU to this cooling fan. You'll notice also that the cooling fan has this small connector, this kind of small connector with the holes in it. Where's a good way to look at it? There's a good, maybe a better way to look at it. No, I can't show you a good way. Oh, there it is. Sorry. The little holes up front. This is called a Berg connector, and this thing plugs right onto a slot on most modern motherboards. Next up is the basic Pentium II, and that's why it's called the Pentium II. Here you see one that has got a fan assembly already on it. It's just attached to a little bit of goo, and so I can take that fan assembly right off. And if we look inside it, peer down right inside that fan assembly, you may be able to see those fins? Those fins are metal vanes that carry the heat off of the CPU. See, the whole idea is the more surface area you have, the more heat you can conduct away. And so these cooling fans help to, these cooling vanes help the fan to pull the heat off of the Pentium. Now, why is this Pentium II in so much greater need of cooling than the Celeron is? Well, the Pentium II is a Celeron with some memory added. And once again, memory is one of those things that will just, even though it's small physically, generates a tremendous amount of heat. Notice also the way it's packaged. This is packaged with this edge connector with the hole in it. Now compare that to the Celeron, and you see the Celeron has a package with a bunch of little pins in it. Those little dots you see are little tiny wires, little legs, pins. This is an older way of packaging chips. The reason we package these guys this way is, I guess, to make the whole cooling package easier, first of all, to insert and to replace. Because the Pentium II is slowly being replaced by its somewhat faster cousin, the Pentium III. And the problem with all this CPU stuff is that everything, there we are. All this CPU stuff is black on black, so it's hard to show it to you. But in any case, once again, what you're looking at is the black package that covers the CPU. What's the Pentium III got that the Pentium II doesn't have? Well, a couple things. First of all, the Pentium 3 runs at slightly higher megahertz, although not significantly so. But the second thing is that the Pentium 3 has a number of new CPU instructions built into it, which makes doing things like graphics and sound easier. That means, in theory, listen for the weasel words, in theory, if someone rewrites your favorite software to use the Pentium 3, then you'll get wonderful multimedia performance. But listen to the important part. You have to have software that's specifically designed to use the Pentium 3, otherwise you have wasted your money. Pentium 3 is a fairly expensive CPU at the moment because it is the fastest thing around. Now, there are other CPUs in the Pentium 2, Pentium 3 family I haven't talked with you about because I don't have examples here, but let me briefly tell you about them. The Xeon, Xeon, is a faster version of the Pentium 2. Its benefits are twofold. One, the memory that it has on board, you may recall that, once again, I'm sorry, if we turn around, let me show you the Pentium 3. Pentium 3's got some great examples here because not only are we seeing the CPU, we're also seeing the memory. There's more memory on a Xeon than on a Pentium 2 or Pentium 3. And in addition, the Pentium 2 and the Pentium 3 speak to their memory more slowly than the Xeon speaks to its memory. So all added up, the Xeon gets considerably more expensive, and that's why if you're looking at Xeon systems versus Pentium 2 systems, Xeons are more expensive. One more point to be made. If you're going to upgrade your system, if you've currently got one of these Pentium 2 systems and you want to upgrade to Pentium 3, you're going to notice that these edge connectors look awfully similar. Well, there's a reason why they look awfully similar. They are the same. It's the same kind of connector. If you have many of the modern motherboards, and by the way, if you're going to buy your own motherboard, the thing you want to look for is a motherboard that is built around the Intel 440BX chipset. That chipset lets you do a whole bunch of stuff, and one of the things it does is that many of these 440BX chipsets will allow you to just pull your Pentium 2 right out and pop in your Pentium 3. But again, you've got to ask yourself the question, do I want to do this? And if you're running old software, the answer is no. There's no point at all to getting a Pentium 3. It won't go faster unless you've got the better software for it. Another example of that is that much of today's software can't even use the full power of the Pentium 2. For example, I'm a big user of NT version 4. Now, NT version 4 is being replaced by Windows 2000, and there's an interesting story because in my experience, if you run Windows 2000 on a Pentium MMX, the old one, at 266 megahertz, it runs considerably more slowly than a Pentium 2 at 266 megahertz. In general, if you're running some game like Frogger, some old game, and you're running on a Pentium 2 versus an MMX at the same speed, you won't see any difference. But with Windows 2000, significantly different performance. And the reason there is because clearly Windows 2000 has been written to use the full power of the Pentium 2 chip. And as time goes on, we'll probably see new software that will run horribly unless you have a Pentium 3 or the Pentium 4 or whatever it is that comes next.